Welcome to the Church Brand Guide Podcast. This is Michael Prasad. Today we're talking about how to build a brand that has integrity. And this is something that is often overlooked, especially in church world, because we kind of take it for granted. But I wanted to point out with this episode that we should be very intentional in the church world to build a brand that's really built on a great foundation of biblical principles, and then to be intentional to let people know that your brand has a great integrity to it. This allows people to put their trust into your brand. You know, a lot of times when we think about branding, we think about the flashy components of branding. You know, a great logo, we think about fonts, we think about great color combinations, we think about marketing tactics on social media and websites, but we forget that a great brand really builds trust with people, especially in the church world. People need to know that they can come and trust you with their money, their time, and their other resources that they want to give as an act of worship. So it's important that churches are very intentional about building a brand that has a great deal of integrity. So I've invited Mark Jones onto the podcast. He is a business owner that is successful. And the thing about most business owners that are successful is that they're going to have to do that with integrity. So they've got to have a good deal of trust built in there to where people trust that they're going to pay for something and then get what they've paid for. Mark is very successful in what he does. He's also very passionate about the church. He's never been on a church staff, so he provides a perspective that's kind of a non-staff perspective. He's very active in his local church and active within the church world in general, and brings a great insight to this topic. So let's get right to it, and let's talk with Mark Jones today on the podcast. All right, thanks for joining me today on the Church Brand Guide podcast. On this episode, I've got Mark Jones, who's coming from a different angle than our usual guests that might be on a podcast. Mark, I've known for a long time. We actually grew up in the same church together, and we both know the power of a good church and how amazing a church can be in someone's life to help shape them and mold them, because we both experienced it. We have very, very similar experiences growing up in a youth group and in just a good, healthy environment there with that. And so I've invited him to come on the podcast because I think he's also kind of evolved into this amazing role as a businessman who does work with churches. So I'll let Mark unpack more about what he does on the podcast, but welcome, Mark, to the podcast.
It's good to be here.
Thanks for doing it. I know this is not normal for you to do something like this. I appreciate you coming out.
I'm good. This is fun.
Okay. All right. So let's get into what you do. Can you describe, just for our audience, just introduce who you are, what you do?
Okay. I am basically I'm the lay person in the church. I've served in the church. I've been involved in the church my entire life. I've never gotten a paycheck from a church, never worked for a church or anything like that. So it's kind of the person that goes to your church that wants to work and serve and help and do that stuff. I'm 38 years old. I've grown up in the church. I grew up the reality was it was a poor family. We didn't have very much money. I grew into middle class. I've been pretty much every aspect of the giving range and the serving range of being part of a body. So I've kind of seen things from the inside from that person. So as I've grown into owning my own businesses and being married and having kids and stuff, I see a lot more than a lot of people see, just because when you own your own business, you have to even judge inwardly at your own business and stuff. So I'm always looking at that. So I've always looked at churches, ways that we could do things better, way that we could change things up or maybe tweak. Sometimes it's communication type deal. Sometimes it's just how the image. I have regular conversations with pastors. I had one just on Wednesday night about a pastor of how he said something and how it came across to the body versus what he meant. I knew what he meant, but the body saw something different. So even after service, and fortunately I had that relationship with him, I was able to say, hey, I would probably word it this way because in these situations, they're going to take it this way. And he's like, oh,